Hi, welcome back to my garden. You might be wondering, if you watched last week's video, how I've got on with Nell Painter's book Old in Art School. Well, I've read about 100 pages and it is interesting. It's particularly interesting to me because of the kind of discussions of how art is viewed in a American fine art faculty versus how one might view art as an amateur or from a more self-taught perspective. And those questions obviously have absolutely nothing to do with the majority of people who follow my videos and the people that I envisage will join me in the Mastery of Self-actualisation course that I am developing. It is worth reading this book for me because it's the story of someone who for many years was a professional in one field and has begun to rethink or has rethought and reimagined herself in another area. And an area that I'm interested in. There are a lot of points that sort of confirm conclusions that I've reached on my journey. But as I say, how much of this is art specific and how much of it is more generally applicable, well, that's another matter. Perhaps one way around this is to find a lot of biographical material in different sorts of areas and make suggestions to people to pick and choose depending on their particular direction. I suspect, however, that there is not exactly a plethora of these sorts of books out there, given how few people do reimagine their lives. Perhaps what I'm going to make do with is a book like it's called Mind Shift by Barbara Oakley, about learning as an adult, or indeed the Late Bloomer book that I mentioned last week. So I'm going to dig around on that because I think it's useful for people, for us, to get some kind of sense of perspective that what we're trying to do is indeed possible, and also perhaps find some measure of inspiration in other people's journeys. So there we are. I will say more about the book when I've finished reading it, but until then I'll move on from that subject matter. And I was wondering, because I reached this conclusion a few days ago, well, what am I going to talk about in the remaining time? And then it popped into my inbox, as it always does. The universe conspired in my favour. Thank you, universe. Scott Young, I've spoken a lot about him before, very interesting chap. If you haven't watched many of my videos, or perhaps if you've forgotten, which is quite possible, how memorable are these little 15-minute garden chats? I don't know. And perhaps the broad spirit of them is something that you can talk about, but the details might get lost over time. So here's a quick bio of Scott Young. He's the guy who did the MIT undergraduate computer science degree in 1 year on his own, self-study. He's also someone who went a year not speaking English and learned 4 languages in that year, if my memory serves me correctly. Spanish, Portuguese, fair enough. Mandarin and Korean, somewhat more challenging. He's also done other projects, learning to draw really good, to a good level, a self-portrait of himself in 1 month. And he's written a book called Ultra Learning on this process of real deep dive immersive learning. And he runs a sort of online course with Cal Newport, another person I name check regularly. He's the Georgia computer science professor who's also written the books Deep Work and So Good They Can't Ignore You, Digital Minimalism, and others. So that's a couple of bios. Scott Young sends out a newsletter every week or so. Very interesting. I heartily recommend it. And this one he was talking about self-actualization, which is obviously right up my street. And he was responding to a reader's email, sort of asking, well, how common is it, really, these kind of stories of people who kind of dramatically turn around their lives and become someone completely new, which is very much connected to the concept of self-actualizing. And in his reply, he talks about how it's certainly something that happened to him in his late teens, where at a certain stage he just decided that he was going to take life much more seriously, and he embarked on a journey which eventually, via many twists and turns, took him to, for example, completing the MIT undergraduate program in 1 year successfully, or as successfully as he could conclude based on all the material, a lot that was out there. But he has a feeling that, in fairness, these stories, whilst they're true, people do self-actualize. Many people might embark in a massive fit of enthusiasm, make enormous progress, and sort of backslide. The kind of gym warrior who undergoes an astonishing transformation over a year, but then one thing and another, and before you know it, they've slipped back into bad habits. Now, I got the feeling reading the email that this term self-actualizing is one that we can use in a sort of success rather than self-discovery sort of way. And obviously, these are not mutually exclusive terms, but it seemed to me, reading his reply, that perhaps part of the problem for a lot of people is that when they're self-actualizing, they're not really self-actualizing as much as doubling down on the sort of validation that they get through success and accomplishment. And these are not the same thing. Now, I'm not a deeply versed in psychology kind of guy. My psychology is very much the short 10, 15-minute YouTube variety or the odd book. But I think this is part of the problem if you broaden this whole discussion to, and he does in his message, to the sort of self-improvement world. He mentions Tony Robbins, the self-improvement guru in America, who is very much in favor of these weekend experiences, by no means cheap experiences, where you, for example, walk on hot coals and get into some ecstatic fervor and turn your life around. And how long-lasting is that really? And yes, there may be an element of self-actualizing, but I think what is going on here is what people are doing is they are looking at activities that they undertake and they are trying to become as successful as possible, but they're doing it on kind of level 4 of Maslow's iconic pyramid of needs. And I've mentioned Abraham Maslow's hierarchy pyramid of needs many times before. And this is an amazingly, I think, powerful theory. I'm not saying it's flawless, no theory is, but it's a very powerful idea that there's this hierarchy beginning with physiological needs, moving up through security needs to essentially love needs, self-esteem needs, and finally self-actualization. So effectively, I think what he's saying is, if we're going to sum it up in a few brief words, that at the beginning we need to meet basic physiological food and water kinds of needs. Then we need to feel safe, I suppose physically and psychologically. We need to then feel loved. And once we're loved, we have those first 3 kind of areas satisfied. To progress, we need to be respected. Essentially for what we do, who we are. And that takes us on to the 4th level, but there is a 5th level which he calls self-actualization. And let me try and give this in concrete terms. Let us imagine that my deep-seated dream is to produce art that is accepted into museum collections. And I'm kind of oversimplifying in an attempt to, I suppose, make a point. So forgive me if this is a fairly loose argument. But getting my piece of art into the museum could be operating on level 4 or level 5. I could be doing this because I have a need for respect that isn't being met. And by having my piece in a museum, people will finally take me seriously, my art, and tell me, wow, Neil, you're an incredible artist. But it could be operating on level 5 as a means of self-actualization, in the sense that actually it doesn't really matter if my art gets into a museum collection or not. Rather, what happened was that I worked on truly expressing myself, who I am, my core identity through my art. And in doing that, I started to produce art that wasn't just technically quite good, but was meaningful on a much deeper, more profound level. And because I'd started to produce more meaningful, profound art, my art started to be accepted on a much deeper or grander scale. Well, as I say, that's probably quite a loose argument, but I think you probably follow what I'm driving at. And I think that in a sense, a lot of people believe that they are striving for self-actualization, but really what they're just trying to do is to meet self-esteem needs. And the problem is that once we meet those needs, it's done. We have to keep maintaining our self-esteem needs. They can need to continue to be met. But doubling down on those, once you're respected as a professional, you're respected as a professional. So then working more and more and more hours, or trying to earn more and more money, or achieve more and more accolades when you are already being respected is not actually going to do you any good. And perhaps what we need to start looking at is how you can actually truly self-actualize. And I think that's what this program of study is all about. That's what I want, what I'm striving for. And I guess the people that I want to share these ideas with will be like-minded people. The idea is that what we're pursuing here may or may not bring you greater accolades. But it's a never-ending journey of realizing yourself through doing things that you were meant to do. A fairly loose term, but I think you know what I mean. Anyway, there we are. Some thoughts on self-actualization. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I trust your lives are filled with joy. And until next week, from sunny Brazil, ciao.